Here is what happens when you introduce maximum uncertainty into an economy. Capital goes on strike, business investment frozen solid, running a low fever nobody takes seriously, ignoring symptoms, refusing the lifestyle changes the doctors recommend. And then one day that patient walks into the operating room and demands the most radical surgery imaginable, not to treat the illness to prove a point. That patient is the United Kingdom, one of the oldest, most powerful economies in human history. The country that invented the Industrial Revolution, the country that once ran a quarter of the entire world, the country that gave the world modern banking, modern law, modern democracy, and right now it is the only G7 nation where real wages have flatlined for 15 years, where a family in Poland will likely be wealthier than a family in Britain by 2030, where the bond market collapsed so spectacularly in 2022 that it brought down a sitting prime minister in 44 days, not in an election, not in a scandal removed by financial markets. This is not a recession. Economists have a different word for what is happening to Britain. They call it de-development. The slow, grinding, almost invisible reversal of wealth and capability in one of the world's most advanced economies. And it didn't start with Brexit, but Brexit may have been the last bullet. In the 1970s, British newspapers called their own country the sick man of Europe. Strikes paralyzed industries for months. Inflation raged out of control. The International Monetary Fund had to bail out the British government in 1976, and humiliation for a nation that once bankrolled the world. Then came Margaret Thatcher. Like her or hate her, she transformed the British economy. She killed the old industrial model and replaced it with something new. Finance services. The city of London, Britain, reinvented itself from a country that made things into a country that moved money. By the 1990s and 2000s, Britain was back. GDP growing, employment rising. London became the financial capital of Europe. Tony Blair's government radiated cool Britannia confidence. Or so they thought, because the cure had a flaw, a fatal design error buried in the foundations that nobody wanted to examine too closely. Britain had rebuilt its economy on a foundation that looked solid from the outside and was dangerously fragile underneath. And when the cracks appeared, Britain didn't fix them. Instead, in 2016, they voted for the most disruptive economic experiment any major democracy had attempted in modern history. Before we go any further, three numbers, because these three numbers tell the entire story more honestly than any political speech ever could. Number 115. The number of years real wages in the United Kingdom have effectively stagnated, not declined, not grown, just flat. Number 2, 10 to 15%. The permanent drop in business investment since the Brexit vote compared to the pre-2016 trend. Number 3, 2030. The year the Resolution Foundation projects that the average Polish family will have higher disposable income than the average British family. How did it come to this? Let's start at the beginning, not 2016, further back. Because to understand the last bullet, you have to understand every wound that came before it. Britain's economic problems didn't start with Brexit. Brexit didn't create a healthy patient. It shot a sick one. Problem 1 is what economists call the productivity crisis. Since the 2008 financial crisis, British productivity has been among the worst in the developed world. An American worker today is roughly 30% more productive per hour than a British worker. A French worker is significantly more productive per hour than a British one. Why? Because Britain systematically underinvests in machinery, in technology, in worker training, in infrastructure. Problem 2 is the financial casino model. When Thatcher restructured Britain in the 1980s, she made a deliberate choice: finance over manufacturing. Britain became a country that moved money rather than made things spectacular when times are good, catastrophic when they are not. September 2008, Lehman Brothers collapses in New York. The global financial system seizes up over a single weekend, and Britain takes the hit harder than almost anyone. The British government bails out its own banks to the tune of £500 billion money that could have built hospitals, schools, and railways. The coalition government that takes power in 2010 responds with austerity, cut spending, reduce the deficit, get the numbers under control. The result, Britain's public infrastructure starts to deteriorate visibly. NHS hospitals, underfunded roads, filling with potholes, schools crumbling, the productive capacity of the state quietly hollowed out, and productivity never recovered. Germany bounced back. The United States roared ahead. Britain flatlined. By 2016, Britain is already weakened, already fragile, showing unmistakable signs of structural decline. And then June 23, 2016, the Brexit referendum, 52% to 48%, Leave wins. June 24, 2016. The morning after the vote, the British pound drops 10% against the dollar overnight, one of the largest single-day currency crashes in history. Currency traders looked at the result and concluded without sentimentality that Britain had just made itself significantly less valuable. That single currency crash immediately made every import more expensive. Everything Britain buys from abroad, food, fuel, medicine, got 10% more expensive overnight. Here's what happens when you introduce maximum uncertainty into an economy. Capital goes on strike. Business investment frozen solid. Factories that would have been built in Birmingham were built in Poland. Instead, research centers that would have opened in London opened in Amsterdam instead. Research estimated that by 2022, the British economy was already 5.5% smaller than it would have been if Brexit had not happened. Not in a dramatic crash, you can see and feel in a slow, invisible erosion the growth that never happened. Jobs that were never created, companies that were never started. The single market is not just a trade agreement. After Brexit, that same lorry stops at the border, customs declaration, checks, paperwork, friction, delay in queues stretching back miles. For small and medium businesses, it was devastating. Many simply stopped exporting to Europe. The paperwork cost more than the profit. The fish are still in British waters, but British fishermen cannot sell them, lost their main export market because of bureaucratic friction that did not exist before. Economists call this the Brexit tax. Every British consumer pays it every single day, spread across millions of households, adding up to a permanent reduction in living standards. Before Brexit, Britain relied heavily on European workers. After Brexit, gaps appeared across agriculture, construction, and most critically, the NHS overnight workers went home or stopped coming. Millions of families had to remortgage at exactly the moment interest rates hit their highest level. Their monthly payment did not creep up slightly, it doubled. In some cases, more than doubled. September 23, 2022. New Prime Minister Liz Truss presents her mini-budget, massive unfunded tax cuts, described with extraordinary confidence as a growth plan. The market reaction was brutal. British government bonds called gilts are supposed to be among the safest investments on earth. In September 2022, international investors begin selling in large quantities, panic selling like to a failing state. British pension funds were hours away from insolvency. The entire UK pension system came within hours of crisis because a prime minister spent 48 hours trying to reassure markets she could not reassure. Liz Truss was gone in 44 days removed, not by voters in an election, but by the bond market, by the judgment of international capital. When bond traders are deciding who governs Britain, something has gone fundamentally wrong. Now, let's talk about the doom loop. A dysfunctional health service means sicker workers. Sicker workers produce a smaller economy. A smaller economy generates less tax revenue around and around, tightening with each rotation. The people with the most options are leaving highly skilled British citizens. Doctors, engineers, researchers are leaving in record numbers for Canada, Australia, the United States for higher salaries and better prospects. So where are we now in 2026? GDP per capita is lower relative to our peers than a decade ago. Nearly 20 years of lost wage growth. Business investment remains 10 to 15% below the pre-Brexit trend. Britain's decline is not irreversible. Britain still has extraordinary assets, world-class universities, the English language. But decline, once it develops, momentum is self-reinforcing, the spiral tightens. The question for Britain is not whether it can recover, it can. The question is whether it has the political honesty and the collective courage to do what recovery actually requires, admitting that something did not work as promised. The last bullet did not have to be fatal, but the patient is still arguing about whether it is sick. And the clock, as it always does, keeps moving. Taking back control. The question history will answer is whether it was worth the price paid.